Well, here we go. I've been tempted to make a video like this since a few months back, and I gotta say, I'm finally glad I can put this video into action. Now when you're a kid, one of your favorite hobbies is watching cartoons, whether it be comedies or serialization shows. And you watch those thinking that it's the greatest thing ever to where you wouldn't do anything at all except tend to watching it all day every day. But as soon as you get older, you begin to start looking at your favorite things with a critical eye, to the point where you feel like it might not be as good as you remember it. That's not to say that you think it's entirely bad, but it's always nice to see the flaws in the things you love. And that basically leads into the subject of good shows that are flawed. I think everyone can agree that no matter how good a show is, it can have a couple of weaknesses. Now this can be down to a couple of factors. Maybe because it has bad episodes, maybe it relies too much on one aspect alone, or maybe because some of its characters are so unlikable. Now I can think of a couple of shows that I liked that sort of had these issues. For example, Sonic Boom, where despite me liking the meta jokes in that show, at the same time they too tend to get in the way of things, and at times they can ruin a ton of moments. And honestly, it would have been nice if the show was remembered for its characters and original jokes. Another example is Phineas and Ferb, where despite it being impressive that they've managed to use the same formula for 4 seasons straight, at the same time it does tend to get boring, and at times just aggravating. Candace wants to bust the boys, wow, never seen that before. But there's one show out there that takes the cake, for how much of its flaws are apparent tend to get in the way of its charm, despite how good it is. And that show is none other than the Powerpuff Girls. As many of you already know, the Powerpuff Girls was a Cartoon Network show created by Craig McCracken that aired from November 18th, 1998 to March 25th, 2005. Ran a total of 78 episodes in the span of 6 seasons, as it was the 5th series of the cartoon shows to be made. The premise of the show goes on like this. Sugar, spice, and everything nuts were the ingredients created to make the perfect little girl, but Professor Utonium accidentally spilled chemical X into the mixture, and thus creating 3 superpowered little girls, who were named Bubbles, Blossom, and Buttercup, as they dedicated their lives to saving Townsville from the forces of evil. Now obviously I didn't grow up watching the show when it was still airing, it was years before my time, and when it ended I was already a year old, but around 2011 is when I found this show and really enjoyed it, even if I didn't remember all that much from it. However, one of my exposures from the show was one of their comic books, which was called Double Whammy, and I also enjoyed that as well. It's too bad I don't remember much of it, but when it was good, it was really good. The same thing applied to the series as well. I stopped caring for it after a long while because I was exposed to other and better shows out there, but I didn't forget about PPG's existence. That wasn't until back in November, where I decided to watch the show's entire 6-season run, and I was pretty disappointed. Now that's not to say that all of it was a step down. There were a ton of episodes I enjoyed, but at the same time there were a couple of major issues that were getting in the way of my experience. So now that you've all read the title of the video, it's time for me to go over why out of all the good cartoons, this series had the most flaws, or why it takes up the entire show. But considering that I still called this a good show, I guess it's only fair to go over what made the show good in the first place. I think to start off we gotta figure out what kind of show it's trying to tell. Because it's clear that over the course of the show, what it was trying to be had already been consistent. We all know it's trying to be a crime-fighting superhero show, but the interesting thing was it was not just that, because it was done in a way of introducing the very idea of feminism and woman empowerment. The funny thing is that Craig McCracken did that unintentionally, as he viewed it as just a show about girls beating up monsters and nothing else. Now as a 7-year-old, the idea of female characters trying to be as capable as men was always something I always looked forward to in media. And this show was no exception. I didn't care what it was trying to represent, because what I was so focused on was seeing 3 6-year-old girls showing off their badassery, and when it comes to just that it ages like fine wine. But the feminism in this show is complemented greatly through the characters' personalities. Blossom is the commander and the leader and always tried to keep her sisters in check. Buttercup is the feisty of the trio but always uses her powers for good. And Bubbles was usually the naive one, but always remained the sweetest one compared to Blossom and especially Buttercup. Now these are some of the best personalities I've seen in the show, and it's done well thanks to the amazing voice performances that Tara Strong, Kathy Cavadini, and E.G. Daily give to these girls. And I like how their voices differentiate from one another. Blossom's voice was meant to sound heroic, Bubbles' voice is all bubbly and cute, and Buttercup's voice is basically that of an edgy rocker. And I do believe that these were the best directions they went for the voice acting in the show. Another thing worth noting is the designs, and I don't know if it's just me, but I think the Powerpuff Girls are the most simplistic designs I've ever seen in a cartoon. Apparently they were inspired by a birthday card Craig McCracken made in 1991, in which he later turned them into TV characters, given how much he liked the designs. And thank goodness, because after hearing complaints that they looked like bugs, he decided to redesign them, but after realizing that the features he gave them were too realistic, he didn't use them for the show and stuck with the originals. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like for them to have hands, feet, and noses? Yes, because the show literally made an entire episode to just that. But either way, I was and still am really digging their character designs here. It definitely makes them stand out. Now, despite the show mainly focusing on the girls, the show was able to give screen time to the other characters, like Professor Utonium, the Mayor, Miss Bellum, Miss Keen, and even the villains. Out of all the secondary characters, I found Miss Bellum to be the most interesting. Like, I literally thought she was going to be an unlikable stereotypical feminist, but she actually turned out to be more likable than I expected. And it really builds off in her relationship with the Mayor, where despite her getting annoyed with him, she really does care for him a ton. I'm also a fan of her design. I know some adult characters have designs where they don't show the face and only the body, but it's interesting with Miss Bellum, as it's meant to satirize how most people look at women purely for their looks. But Miss Bellum actually has character, and it's what I liked more from her. Although this can be applied to the worst characters of media, where their designs are the only redeeming factor. But I believe the characters that absolutely steal the show would have to be the villains. And I'll tell you this right now, after watching the show from start to finish, the Powerpuff Girls is one of those shows where I like the villains more than the heroes, with my favorites being the main ones such as Mojo, Jojo, and him. Mojo for how funny he is with him turning every sentence he has into a monologue. It's just so cleverly written, and his voice actor Roger L. Jackson did a fantastic job in portraying him here. And as for him, I enjoy how threatening he is, and Tom Kane's performance goes so fucking hard on his character. I mean, he's literally named him. Like, how could you not make a name like that more menacing? I also enjoy the rest of the antagonists, like Princess Morbucks, the Gang Green Gang, and even the Rowdy Rough Boys of all people. I think they all have a leg to stand on when it comes to how they're presented, and like Mojo and him, their voice actors give it their all. You know what else was giving its all? The animation. The Powerpuff Girls has really strong animation. About 90% of the time it does take place during the action scenes, which I know for a fact that the animators tried their damn best to make sure the pain is as brutal as it can be. An example would have to be that they show realistic blood, which was shocking for Cartoon Network standards, but damn, these animators and storyboarders have balls. Like, we literally have the iconic scene in the intro where Buttercup kicks him in the teeth. See, now that was sweet. Another thing that makes the animation so great is the character poses. It's so strong, and it really makes you believe that you're watching the most badass cartoon ever. It really brings out the interest in me a lot, and I love how it has a ton of energy put into it, as opposed to making it stilted and minimal. And it makes even more sense when Craig McCracken views these episodes as mini-films, which would also explain how the score for each episode was meant to be scored like a movie. Overall, these were some of the aspects from the show I really enjoyed, more than I thought I would, but unfortunately there are certain flaws that do tend to get in the way of my experience, so I guess I should just get it out of the way. But before we talk about that, I guess we should start off by talking about the decline for the series, as it's what many people touch upon when discussing the show, even today. But first, let me take you back to July 3rd, 2002, which was the release of the Powerpuff Girls movie, as it was to be the first Cartoon Network theatrically released film. I wonder how long it took for the developers to realize how bad of an idea that was. But this would mark the last thing Craig McCracken has ever worked on for the series before moving on to Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends in 2004. Now, the movie is one of the main things people talk about when discussing the decline for this series, as it released around the end point of season 4. But the thing is, they wouldn't be talking about the movie itself, but more to the point of how it was a financial failure and a box office bomb. And yeah, they're right about that, but that doesn't mean the movie itself was written off horribly. Basically, it's an origin story of how the girls became superheroes, to which I think they did a decent job at it, with it expanding upon the story more. But the main highlights of the film was the animation, the visuals, and the score. Oh god, the score goes so hard. But everything else was disappointing, with the obvious ones being the characters and the character dynamics. Of course, the relationship between Mojo and the girls was an exception. So in the end, the movie wasn't all that bad. I saw like 6.5 out of 10. Although the interesting thing about it was that Craig McCracken initially regretted the tone of this film, as he wished it would have been more lighthearted as opposed to making it completely dark. But despite it not representing the characters right, I didn't really mind the tone, as it's greatly complemented to the aesthetics. Now, remember when I said that the movie being released in the theaters was a bad idea? Well, after the film flopped with how much it made, Cartoon Network didn't release any cinematic film for the next 16 years, which was disappointing because we could have gotten more C-Ed movies released in the cinemas like Ed and Eddie's Big Picture Show, but that film along with the rest of the others were turned into TV movies. That wasn't until 2018 where they decided to do it again with Teen Titans Go to the Movies, which wasn't a box office bomb, but Cartoon Network still didn't bother making any theatrical movies based off of their shows, at least not frequently. Who knows, maybe it'll happen again. But a year later, after the PPG movies released, the show was brought back again with a 5th and 6th season. But these two seasons had some significant changes. Now let's start off with the elephant in the room. Craig McCracken isn't involved with the show anymore, as again he wanted to work on Foster's. Now everyone knows that SpongeBob SquarePants creator Steven Hillenburg did the same thing after finishing the SpongeBob movie, but the difference here is that he wanted the film to mark the show's end, while Craig McCracken intended for the show to continue, even when he thought of the movie idea. Another thing that changed within the show was the art style, which starting from its movie, it moved from Hanna-Barbera Productions to Cartoon Network Studios. And it makes total sense given how much it differed from the first 4 seasons' art style, with it going from being completely hand-drawn to being drawn with digital ink. Now quite frankly, and I know people are going to disagree with me on this, but I truly think the art style in seasons 5 and 6 along with the movie are much better than the Hanna-Barbera art style, with everything looking more sharp than before and the colors being more saturated. And I didn't even mind the pressed flat pupils that some of the characters have. If anything, I see that as a unique opportunity for style, because it's complemented well through the fluid animation and especially the designs. Sure, at times the art style can make the characters look off model, but again the animation does make up for that. But since we're still talking about those 2 seasons, I want to say what everyone else has to say. Many people agree that seasons 5 and 6 were the worst seasons of the series, with the main factor being its writing. And yeah, they're not wrong, but I don't know. I don't think there was ever a moment where I would call these episodes an abomination. Sure, a lot of them were bad, but I feel like at the same time they're really tamed even by today's standards. What really bothered me was the fact that people tried to act like those 2 particular seasons were the only ones with bad episodes. And to that I object, because there are a ton of bad episodes from the other seasons as well. Granted, they're not as bad as the ones in 5 and 6, but there were a ton of shit that made them miserable to sit through. And speaking of miserable, I feel like it's time to tackle the subject that a lot of you came to this video for, and I'm sure I'll enjoy talking about this part the most. It's no secret that many people have claimed this series to be some kind of godsend, with them praising the shit out of it. And that's not to say that they're wrong, but I feel like there are certain issues that I have that not a lot of people don't really seem to touch upon, and finally needs addressing. First and foremost, this show is really not that funny. Now I'm not saying that it could never get a laugh out of me, but the only times that it actually did came from how the characters were written, what their personalities are supposed to be. An example would have to be Mojo, where again one of his main things is that he reiterates a lot of what he says of monologuing whatever came to his mind. In fact, it became so apparent that the show took notice of it and had the characters mock him for it.
I, Mojo, with my blah 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 blah, shall rule the world. I will be the one in control. Total global power shall be my responsibility. I
do not repeat myself like that. I am clear, concise, and to the point. Reiterating is not my thing.
So it's like you can't find it annoying. They can go too far with making an entire episode about it called Mo Languish, but I still like the concept along with the residents of Townsville speaking Mojo's language. My only gripe was with the girls uncharacteristically getting annoyed with this, despite having to put up with it in numerous episodes before this. Along with Mojo, the mayor can also be funny at times as well, with the majority of it coming from his own stupidity. But besides those 2 characters, the show is just so humorless. In fact, most of its humor can come from the characters having their moments where they're just so unlikable towards one another, which generally it can work, but I think the reason why it fails is because aside from a couple of funny lines, the dialogue hardly seems all that interesting. Neither is the direction of it. I think a suggestion for how the humor can be improved is not only making the dialogue have a ton of appeal to it, but maybe occasionally they can tackle meta humor, so we'll be able to poke fun at what my next issue is with the show, and that's the fact that it's way too formulaic. Not as much as Phineas and Ferb or Season 1 Sonic Boom, but trust me, it's right up there. Basically, every episode will start off with, "The City of Townsville, a harmonious community of happy little people." Crime fighting ensues, and they repeat this trope for 6 seasons. I understand that the series is trying to be consistent, but it really doesn't help when almost every episode begins with the girls fighting one of their foes. They plot their revenge, it fails, and then they get beaten up again. Or maybe the same thing happens in the beginning, but with a new one-note villain arising to show their distaste for the Powerpuff Girls, and wants them gone for good. Don't get me wrong, there are a couple of episodes that do that just fine, but I can tell you that those ones were intentional, and it came at a time when the show had really interesting ideas. Until the later seasons where they just make the episodes just to get them out there really isn't any heart poured into it, which honestly made the formula more boring than it already was. But I assure you that this type of issue, despite it being noticeable, is easy to tolerate, and it's a lot easier to tolerate than my final and perhaps my biggest issue with this series, the character dynamics. In fact, this is my main reason why I've dedicated an entire video to this show. I don't usually say this often, or even at all, but one of the main things I mainly focus on in media is the characters and how they interact with one another, regardless of how bland the plot is. So before I decided to take a look at every episode of the Powerpuff Girls, I was hoping that they would put a ton of emphasis on the character interactions. I spoke too soon after watching it. I won't try to say that every character relationship is bad, but I feel like there are many instances where they hardly want to expand upon them at all, and just stay with the exact same dynamic they've had from beginning to end with little to no development. As a result, it just leaves a lot of things feeling so inconclusive. I suppose it all comes from the fact that the show isn't all that serious. I mean, the creator made it clear that he didn't want it to make the show an all-around serialized show, but even lighthearted shows can also take themselves seriously, especially when it comes to all the characters and the situations that they're put in. But with PPG, they do make it a lighthearted show for the most part, but they're so occupied with cheap jokes that are basically the equivalent of jangly keys in a child's face, especially when it comes to ruining heartwarming moments between characters. Now I will say, while I don't appreciate any of the relationships here at all, the worst I can say that they're just boring. Sure, they can make me laugh, but they never seem to get a reaction out of me. But let me tell you, they're all easier to tolerate than the relationship between the Powerpuff Girls, and they had it the worst of it all. Why is that? Clearly they're the stars of the series, so surely they would have all this time to explore how they interact with each other, right? No. It's really strange. You'd think for a show that goes on for such a long time that would also take time to develop, but it starts to hurt when after watching the show that I hardly saw any differences within the characters' personalities. Because despite me enjoying it with the Powerpuff Girls, at the same time I just expected the writers to add new traits within them. But they don't. And it does suck hard because watching 3 superpowered little girls beating the fuck out of monsters was good enough for 7-year-old me, but as an 18 and 19-year-old it just leaves me wanting more. Now I will say that on their own, despite it being one-dimensional a lot of the time, it's much better than how they are with each other. And let me tell you, it is either too unbearable or just flat out non-existent. And almost every episode wasn't afraid to make it apparent. Now I know people are probably going to tell me, oh but Burster, you do realize that it would completely detach from the actual plots of the episodes? It wouldn't be right for a one-liner or a joke to interrupt the scene. In a way that's actually true, especially when it's not even relevant to what's going on. But if there's one thought I've had in my mind for months, is that if there's one thing you gotta take into consideration when it comes to writing a show about characters doing stuff together, is that you should basically establish a relationship between them. But here's something you should know. In spite of criticizing the non-existent nature of the so-called dynamic between the girls, the one thing that takes the cake for how bad it is how they treat Bubbles. I mean no exaggeration when I say that Bubbles, in my opinion, is the best written female character I've seen in media. I know a lot of you will disagree with me on that, but personally I've had this on my mind for quite a while. She's just so fucking likable. Every time I see her on screen, I just know she's gonna pull off a quirky or bubbly moment, and it touches my heart every single time knowing how sweet she is. And Tara Strong fucking killed it with her voice. I mean, nobody would have given a better performance than her. And it's interesting because when looking back on her character from when I first heard about her, I thought she was gonna be one of those little girls who looks cute on the outside but hot-headed on the inside, kind of like a lot of other little girl characters nowadays. But no, she's just sweet out of genuine kindness, and even in some of the worst episodes of the series still had Bubbles be in character, to the point where it's all around impossible for me to hate her. Unless you want to count her pushover streak. Despite Bubbles' traits being that of a very likable character, those traits are used in such a negative light, which fun fact made a handful of these episodes miserable to sit through. Sure, most of them didn't have anything to do with the stories, but at the same time I can't overlook any of them because they have to portray it in such a harsh way imaginable, and it all boils down to her sister's opinion of her. For the entirety of the show's 6-season run, Buttercup has been a non-stop cunt towards Bubbles. In fact, it has gone so far to where I never even bought their relationship with each other. It becomes forced as fuck, and I don't see them creating a bond at all. I wouldn't mind it if it was used for the first 2 seasons, because then the show would have plenty of moments where they start to appreciate each other's company, and Buttercup would eventually warm up to Bubbles' quirky nature. But no, she fucking hates her with a burning passion.
I'm the leader now. I answer the hotline.
Gotta be fucking kidding me, dude! Fucking hate that fucking character, dude!
I get that Buttercup is the tough one, and I understand that it's not always easy making a tough character likable, but I feel like when it comes to her opinion on Bubbles, they didn't even bother having any sweet moments between the two. Instead, they have her just shit on her no matter what she does, even when it wasn't doing any harm. But despite how annoying this can get, I would have rather be it like that if it wasn't for Blossom siding with Buttercup all the time. But isn't Blossom supposed to be the smart one, let alone the mature one? If so, then why would she take the side of someone who has no reason to show bitterness and resentment for so long? Like, Blossom almost never approaches Bubbles with any kindness most of the time. In fact, she is just as impatient as Buttercup. Which is honestly sad, because I thought since Bubbles couldn't create a bond with Buttercup, she could do so with Blossom. But no, she just comes off as someone who wants a child that isn't appreciated at all, especially when there were episodes that showed us that she was more than just a cute little bunny. But there weren't enough moments of dialogue that had her sisters compliment her throughout the episodes, because I assume they think it wouldn't be relevant at all to the story. But the sad thing about all of these shitting on Bubbles scenes is that a lot of them are true. Blossom and Buttercup antagonizing their sister is one thing, but what makes it all worse is the fact that it was completely intentional. more specifically with making Bubbles do all of these bad things, meaning that they want you to actively think of her as the character who messes everything up. Well, everyone except me, because I know that it isn't entirely true. To me, as much as I despise this running gag, I would have preferred it to be that way, because at least the show doesn't make it clear that it isn't relevant to the stories, no matter how exaggerated they can make them. But no, they have to go out of their way to make entire episodes surrounding it, and has that not been done then with Season 3's Helter Skelter? In this episode, Professor Utonium tells Bubbles not to bring any animals home, but she does it anyway, which of course creates conflict, and after misinterpreting what the professor told her at the end, she decides to free all the animals from the zoo. I'm not going to call this a bad episode, although if it was an episode that just featured Bubbles, it would have been amazing, but it was really let down for how much they want you to believe Bubbles was completely in the wrong, which she was, but her family's opinion of it did not help at all, and the fact that her sisters came to the realization that she only did it to spite them and not through her love for her animals, which makes me believe that they have some kind of bias, not just in this episode but for a ton of others too. What about an All Chucked Up, where Buttercup doesn't care about the art Bubbles has made using chalks, and instead only cares about taking up the whole blacktop, which as a result has her destroying the chalks and not giving a fuck. I feel like these examples really emphasizes my point more about Blossom and Buttercup not appreciating her sister much, and instead only care if she does something bad, which while justified, the fact that they have to make them unlikable as possible comes off as really distracting. It only makes me care about Bubbles more, despite the wrong she has done, and I don't even mind her wrongdoings at all because she's never a bitch about it, and she's still shown to be charming and likable, and I would rather have a character like that than somebody boring who's incapable of doing anything wrong. I'm looking at you, Blossom. But despite my negativity towards this aspect of the relationship and the relationship in general, I won't go out and say that there aren't any redeeming factors, because believe you me, there are, and they have contributed to some of the best episodes of the whole show. One example would have to be Octi Evil, where the plot is centered on Blossom and Buttercup arguing after the most recent fight, only to be arranged by him, and after the two save Bubbles from the fight from earlier, they begin to talk about how lucky they are to have her as a sister, and that any animosity shouldn't get in the way of their relationship. I've always looked forward to a moment like this, and it really highlights the best aspects of their dynamic. Another one would have to be Bubble Vicious, which might just be my favorite out of any episode I've seen in the series, and after watching all the others made me appreciate this one a lot more. The episode is about Bubble setting out to be hardcore after being told constantly that she's nothing more than a softie. Now, the concept of kind characters being tough in an episode isn't always easy to do, because you gotta not only keep them in character, but you also gotta make the characters have some kind of motive for doing so. Although with Bubble Vicious it was through provoking, but it still manages to work very well, especially when we get a ton of scenes showing off how great of a fighter Bubbles is. But another thing that made this episode amazing was how Blossom and Buttercup reacted to it, where instead of them just simply yelling at her by calling her a maniac, they just simply approach her calmly and tell her that it isn't the Powerpuff way, which really shows off the best aspects of their characters here, and prove that they don't need to react to everything in an angry light, because there are rare moments where they learn how to take shit easy.
The Bubbles you know is gone! I'm hardcore now! But, you're going overboard. That's not the Powerpuff way.
But despite me saying that they're great examples, they're only great in context of the episode themselves, because by then they go back into relying on the same shtick of making fun of Bubbles for the sake of forced humor, and purposely making Bubbles do all that shit just so the characters can have legitimate reason to gangbang her. Anyways, I've rambled on and on about this aspect of the relationship. I apologize if it looked like I'm milking it to death, but it's really sad how something like this was charming to me as a kid, only for me to grow older and realize that it was painful. And even though I would be expecting this as each episode came by, I would still be caught off guard either way. It's just depressing, really. If I can get back to the relationship between the girls, there have been some moments between them that try to be as heartwarming as Bubble Vicious and Octi Evil, but are ruined by some dumbass joke, or the fact that nothing has been building up to that moment at all. An example would have to be Season 4's All Chucked Up, where Buttercup purposely breaks Bubbles' chalks, for what I can only assume is for the audience to remind us that Buttercup hates Bubbles, and they don't even bring it up until the end of the episode to where she apologized to her at the end. But let's be real, it didn't feel like an apology at all. I think everyone can agree that the episode would have been better if it showed off Buttercup's point of view, where she questions whether or not it was right to make Bubbles upset for her own benefit, and the episode had a lot of time to do that considering it was a half-hour episode as opposed to the usual standard 11. Another example would have to be Powernoia, where they try to have yet another moment where they're like, "We're sisters and we love each other!" But that moment failed because it's interrupted with an unfunny joke of Buttercup claiming how cheesy it was. But I can't entirely blame her here, because like All Chucked Up, there wasn't any sweet sibling moments between the girls that were leading up to that moment. All we got was Blossom yelling at Bubbles to get over her fear, and her teasing Buttercup to do the same, to the point where I don't even buy the scene because it comes right out of nowhere. But there's one episode that gets talked about a lot when it comes to the relationship between the girls, and it's the season 2 episode, Powerpuff Girls' Best Rainy Day Adventure Ever, which has been widely praised as one of the best episodes of the series. After a rainy day occurs in Townsville, Bubbles, Blossom, and Buttercup have to find a way to entertain themselves while being isolated. This involves pretending to be the Powerpuff Girls in their own room. Don't ask, Bubbles was the one who thought of it, to which the others were surprisingly on board with. But if you want my opinion, I didn't think this episode was all that amazing. I mean, you can't really blame me, it's so overrated. The thing about this episode, however, is that the idea alone is something I really like. The girls spending time with each other and playing like little kids, but in terms of the execution, I think it could have been handled better. I didn't like the scenes where the characters were so argumentative with one another, and no, I didn't like the scene when Bubbles knocked Blossom into a wall, but her yelling at the former wasn't satisfying either, which was a scene that everyone seemed to praise. But I don't know. It just didn't leave any satisfaction at all. But yeah, this is basically a long-winded way of saying that the relationship between the Powerpuff Girls is some of the worst I've ever seen in media. And I didn't even know it was heavily possible for this relationship to be heavily criticized. At least by me. And I have absolutely nothing but respect for Craig McCracken. And I'm not going to say this as a way of showing him up, but not even he knew about the girls' dynamic at all. Even since the beginning. To the point where I assumed that he was so reluctant on making this a crime fighting show and a crime fighting show only, instead of also focusing on the family dynamic. The only time that they have it through their relationship with Professor Utonium, and they have a ton of sweet moments together, but it would be great if they expanded more and focused on the girls having a bond with one another. And by that it can also be in pairs too, like Bubbles bonding with Blossom, and Blossom bonding with Buttercup, but alas, it was never meant to be. It's weird for me to say that I still love this show, despite me bitching about it for the entirety of the second half, and in some cases it does feel like I'm biased, but honestly there was just so much I wanted to get out of my system as opposed to completely sugarcoating it. As I've said earlier, this series was ultimately praised as one of the best shows of all time, and to that I'm honestly happy that the series got a ton of praise, although at times they can go overboard with it. But as for me, it could have been so much, yet it ended up being so little. Could've, would've, should've, that doesn't matter to me, because while I do still have a ton of respect for this series, I just see it as some kind of disappointment that doesn't really expand much, especially when it had this many years to do so. To anyone that is willing to go back and watch shows from the childhood that they haven't seen in years, I wouldn't recommend this as someone's first time going back to a show. Although if you end up seeing it through, hey, I won't judge. If there's one thing I can say about the series is that it existed in the first place. It represents why a lot of good shows can be really problematic for a ton of viewers, and this series is the biggest example of that. And that was honestly shocking for me, considering that a lot of the other shows I love have some of these issues, although they're not as apparent as the Powerpuff Girls. I wanted to go back to the show thinking it would be as good as I can remember, but quite frankly, I never thought it wouldn't age just as good as it did back in 2011. And as time went on with watching the show, my expectations got really low, knowing that I didn't know what to expect. But Powerpuff Girls managed to surprise me a lot of just how nonsensical it get. But in the end, the series didn't even meet those low expectations, because when it comes to everything else, particularly with the character dynamics, it's a void, where nothing happens and nothing matters. And because of that, this is one show I'm never marathoning again. Unless I have to do it for some kind of occasion, but what are the chances of that happening?